All right, we're live. Hi, everyone. My name is Cecil Phillip, and welcome to On.NET Live, where we talk about a lot of the great things that are happening in the world of .NET. Today, I have a community member, Richard Morris, and he's going to talk to us about how we could use a really cool open source tool called Swashbuckle to help us with generating documentation for our web APIs. So before we kind of get into it and really dive into what's going on, Richie, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what do you do?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, my name is Richie Morris. I'm currently a director in software engineering with Getty Images, and as Cecil said, I'm also the creator of Swashbuckle, which is an open source tool to help document APIs that are built on ASP.NET Core. And really it does that by kind of bringing OpenAPI, the OpenAPI specification and the various tools that come with it, kind of bringing that to ASP.NET Core. I'm from Dublin, Ireland, but I did live in Seattle from 2010 to 2018, and it was kind of during that time that I originally created Swashbuckle, initially targeting the web API stack, and now obviously the project's kind of gone from strength to strength and gained support and adoption. We have obviously the .NET Core version now, and it's been a really exciting journey, and I'm very excited to be on the show to talk about today.
Awesome, Richie. And we're really so glad that you can join us. And before we actually start diving into Swashbuckle and talking about some things, why don't we take a look at some of the updates that are happening this week and this month? Because I feel like so much is going on in February, and we really need to talk about some of these things. So I'm going to share my screen really quickly, and dun dun dun. Right. So first thing I want to bring to everyone's attention: February 25th. So just in a couple of weeks, we're going to have another .NET Conf Focus event. This one is going to be all about Windows. So you can learn about a lot of the different desktop technologies in .NET, from UWP to WPF to WinForms to all the great stuff that's going on in the world of Windows development. So definitely head over to focus.netconf.net. Make sure you click on Save the Date. And again, this is a free event too, so no registration required, no emails, or no money needs to be paid. You can just show up and sit back and enjoy all the great presentations from the community. So definitely check that out. And also, too, some of you may or may not know this, but this is actually Web API Month on the on.NET Live channels. So we have a lot of great things that are going on across the streams, but also on the blogs. So our friend Brady wrote a really cool blog post about creating discoverable web APIs with ASP.NET Core. He wrote this one last week, and this is actually a really easy read. Talks a lot about Swashbuckle, which is what we're going to be talking about today, um, and also talks about like some of the different attributes you could use to really enhance your web API to create like that correct and accurate documentation. So definitely recommend you check this out. This is over at the ASP.NET blogs. So again, this is from our friend Brady. And the last one I want to share you is another one from Brady. Brady's the star of the show this week. This one is about open source HTTP packages and tools. And in this one, he kind of goes through a couple of different options for generating OpenAPI. He talks a little bit about client generation too, API versioning and like some of those other really cool tools that you could use when you're building your web APIs. So again, this is API month, and we're going to be talking a lot about APIs for the next couple of weeks. So these are just some of the really cool blog posts that we have so far on the blog. So definitely recommend that y'all go ahead and check those out. And so that's enough for me. So I'm going to take my screen off. And now, Rishi, it's all about you, man. This is your show. So why don't we start off with talking a little bit about like what is OpenAPI? Like what is OpenAPI? Why do we care about it? Like why does it even exist?
Yeah. So OpenAPI, formerly Swagger, it used to be called. I still kind of jump back and forth between the terms, but trying to stick to the new naming. So call me out if I get it wrong. But yeah, OpenAPI. It's basically a description language, a platform agnostic specification for describing HTTP REST style APIs. So it describes the various resources or URIs that an API exposes, the different HTTP verbs that are supported on those resources. The different response codes that could be returned, different payload structures, and all of that stuff, really just describing the behavior of your API, and it can be expressed in either a JSON format or a YAML format. I would say like there has been things like this before. The one that comes to mind is something like WSDL for SOAP. I think one of the reasons I think why OpenAPI has been more successful. I think it's more expressive than the WSDL. You can just kind of look at an OpenAPI document and you can really just understand it pretty easily. It's easy to read. But I think the biggest reason why it's been so successful is that it's kind of just been open source from the ground up. So starting with the specification itself, but then a ton of really awesome tools that leverage that specification and can really help developers with their workflow, help API authors provide really nice documentation for their APIs. So basically, if you have an open API document that describes your API, you can use a ton of, as I said, really useful tools. For example, the Swagger UI is one that comes to mind. And if you use Swashbuckle, you'll be very familiar with the Swagger UI. But that's an open source project. It's independent of Swashbuckle, but what Swashbuckle pulls it in and exposes it. But basically, it's a front end application, and you point it to the OpenAPI document, and it generates a really nice UI. Actually, I can just kind of show you a really quick example just to show you what I'm talking about. But you can see here, this is the kind of pet store example. Are you guys able to see this?
Yeah, your screen's being shared right now.
Perfect. Yeah. So you can see here, this is the OpenAPI document that is powering this application, and you can see here it describes every aspect of your API in a really nice documentation format. In addition to just listing out the various operations, it also has kind of sandbox functionality, so you can actually try it out and do different things. So really useful. tool and this is just the start of what you can do when you're able to describe your API with an OpenAPI document. In addition to the Swagger UI, you've got other UI tools. Redoc is another one, but then you've also got various code generators. There's generators that can create your service code, but there's also code generators that can create client code based on the OpenAPI document. There's auto rest and swag, there's just Swagger code gen. There's a ton of them out there, so very, very useful as well. So that's what OpenAPI is. As I said, there's a whole ecosystem of tools built around it. And then what is Swashbuckle? Well, really, Swashbuckle just tries to bring all of these things to your ASP.NET application and do it as seamlessly as possible. So really, with just a couple of lines of code in your startup CS, you can expose auto-generated OpenAPI JSON or YAML. You can also just automatically expose this Swagger UI as well. So just with a couple of lines of code, you can basically have really nice documentation like this up and running for your application. The other advantage is because it's generated. The API description is generated from your code, from your controllers, your routes, your models. As you change your API, as you make changes, your documentation stays automatically up to date with those changes in your code.
Nice. And I'm looking in the chat really quickly. We have a lot of folks that seem to be like huge fans of some of the stuff that you've been doing. So really quickly, I'm going to just bring up one from Paul. And Paul is saying, "Hey, Richard, just want to say thanks. Swashbuckle is an extension I use in all of my projects. It's amazing." So yeah, I'm sure you definitely appreciate that. And we have another user. This one's also coming in from YouTube. It says, "Hi, Richie. Swashbuckle is a wonderful tool. I use it with my web APIs." So again, lots of folks seem to be really loving what Swashbuckle does. And I kind of also wanted to summarize super quick, so how do we kind of segment those tools that you spoke about? So there's Swashbuckle, right, which is like your tool. It's a .NET tool, and it kind of brings in or kind of ties your web APIs with some of these other open source offerings. And like you mentioned, there's the Swagger tools, and then the Swagger tools also build up on top of OpenAPI. So we're talking about like 3 different things here, but they all kind of come together to make that experience for developers better, and particularly for .NET developers, because again, Swashbuckle is a .NET specific like API tool.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's right.
Nice. So if I wanted to get started with Swashbuckle today, what would I need to do? Like, what would that kind of look like?
Yeah, well, I guess I could run through a quick demo. I'll just spin up. Let's see. Spin up a new instance of Visual Studio, because it's actually as part of the .NET 5 release, support for Swashbuckle is automatically included in the application template. So I'm going to create a new project here. I'm going to be really original with the name and call it Demo, not Demon.
Nice.
And yeah, as I said here, so you can see here if you select the ASP.NET Core Web API template, and there's a couple of different options here, but you can see down here there's a checkbox to enable OpenAPI support. So if you click on that, generate your application, the template itself will automatically pull in Swashbuckle, and it'll add the couple of lines of code to your startup to get the application up, to get it wired up. So this is our our familiar weather forecast application. I've literally just created it. If I go ahead and build, I should now be able to run it, and here is what's being displayed. So just like that, out of the box, I have the documentation for the weather forecast sample application, and you can see here you've got your get endpoint for weather forecast. You have the kind of the schema description of the weather forecast, the response. It's a collection of these weather forecast objects. You can see the different types that they are. And then you can try it out. So we can go and call the endpoint, and as you can see, there's the response. And you know, this is all the Swagger UI tool, and what's, I think, this is just the whole open source thing. That's, as you know, Swashbuckle kind of packages this up in the library, and so you kind of get the Swagger UI tool for free. But it's also, I'm constantly keeping it up to date with new versions of the Swagger UI. So like every time I open this, I see new functionality that's been added to the Swagger UI. Like I can see here, you've got the syntax highlighting here in the response body, or they're providing a curl example. And this is just kind of really where you see the power when you bring these open source tools together, and they've got like a thriving community and a lot of work going on. You just constantly see new features getting added all the time. So yeah, this is just getting started. There we go. We've got our Swagger UI. This is the OpenAPI document that it's all powered from, and this really, the core of what Swashbuckle does, the most complex code in the library, is really generating this, right? So it's looking at your controllers and your action methods, the models, taking into account the behavior of your serializer, whether you're using system text JSON or you're using Newtonsoft. It all does all that to try and create a really accurate description of your API behavior. And yes, I mean, that's really what's at the core of Swashbuckle, is generating this OpenAPI document, and then it makes it really easy to bundle the Swagger UI in to use that document.
So I got a quick question, man. So for
Sure,
you,
yeah.
since you said like you're bringing in the Swagger UI into Swashbuckle,
Yeah.
how do you keep up with updates? Right? And then do you ever have a situation where an update comes in and like it breaks some tests or some functionality or something like that?
Yeah, it generally doesn't.
That's good.
I do have. I mean, in the project itself, I have a couple of integration tests that run. So every time I pull in a new version, it'll at least check that the Swagger UI loads. It's. I mean, I guess it's more of a kind of happy path smoke test. It just makes sure that certain things I can see on the page here. So I've got a couple of integration tests. I suppose the other thing is the Swagger UI project does adhere to semantic versioning, so I kind of know if it's just a patch update, I can pull it in and feel fairly confident it's not going to break anything. If it's a minor version, I might just do a little bit more upfront testing before I release the next version of Swashbuckle with that version of the Swagger UI.
Got it. And we got a question coming in from Sergio from YouTube, and I want to make sure we address this.
Yeah.
Sergio's asking, Postman is a very similar tool, isn't it? So like, how does Postman relate to the Swagger UI?
Yeah. I think similar. I think the thing about Postman is it's a tool that you can use to call APIs, but you don't get. You have to kind of put in the like the URL. You have to put in you specify which verb you want to use. It doesn't tell you anything. It's not telling you how the API works. It's just giving you a way to test it out. So you kind of, if you're using Postman, you're typically going to have the API's documentation up in a browser, right? Like their documentation, and you'd be reading, okay, how do I get users? Okay, it's telling me here I need to do a get to /users, and then you'll put that into Postman. I guess the advantage of the Swagger UI is really it's all there for you, right? It's there you go. It lists every operation. So I suppose to summarize, I would say Postman is a testing tool. It's a sandbox. It's not really for documentation.
Right. And kind of like what you said, like one, you can have some of these Swagger tools like built into your API, right? And so as you publish them, like you publish the docs along with them. And so this Swagger UI, this tool is more than just testing it, but it's documentation, it's looking at the schema, it's looking at different response codes and operations and all these types of things. And it does it by inspecting like your controllers and your endpoints and whatever. Versus Postman doesn't know anything about ASP.NET, it doesn't know about your controls, it doesn't know about your project, and you have to tell it what's available. So that, I guess from that perspective, it's a little different.
Exactly. Yeah. And that kind of touches on a really interesting topic. And I know we kind of talked about maybe talking about this later, but it seems like a good time to Kind of the whole idea. One of the fundamental philosophies of Swashbuckle is that the code is the truth, right? Like everything, the way that your API behaves, right, and that's all based on how you've implemented it, how you've, what kind of bindings you're using for your parameters, whether it's from query, from body, or from path, like what your serializer behavior. That is the truth, right? That's how your API behaves. And Swashbuckle really tries to inspect that code and describe it as it is. And so, what I often get a lot of issues kind of saying, the docs don't say this, and I would kind of respond and say, well, have you checked that your API is actually behaving the way that you think it is? And often you'll find that there's something there in the implementation that actually the API isn't behaving the way that they thought they was. So it's a key point about kind of the philosophy behind Swashbuckle. The goal of it was really to meet developers where they are, right? And where they are, it has been writing code and then writing documentation. And that's really what Swashbuckle does, and does it very well. There is in the API space, there is an alternative approach, which is design first, and I think Brady's mentioned in a couple of posts, and that's a little different to Swashbuckle, because in that case, what you're really doing, you're starting with the specification. So you write your specification, and I'll just show there's a Swagger provides a lot of tools for this. There's a Swagger editor where basically you can start writing your spec over here, and it'll automatically show you what the documentation would be like. So here, for example, I'm talking about a dog. Maybe I want to add another property here called foo, type string, and you can see here now, when I look at my dog description, there's foo, there's my new property. The workflow that you would use with this approach is you create your specification first, so it's really designed first, and then you might use the spec to maybe generate your web API code, or use it for testing or something like that. So there's really the two alternative approaches, but I would say Swashbuckle, the goal is to really kind of meet developers where they are, instead of looking for them, to switch to a different workflow for developing their APIs. So I think that's just a key point in regards to Swashbuckle and the approach that it tries to take and the problems that's trying to solve.
Right. And one way I look at that particular example too is, like, I'll compare that to Entity Framework, Entity Framework Core. Yeah. You can have a database first, or you could write the code first that will generate the database.
Exactly, so, again,
same concept, right? So depending on how you like to build your apps and whatever requirements your team has, you can pick and choose like what angle you want to attack the problem from first, and then kind of go along from that perspective and keep going.
Exactly.
So how will we talk about a little bit? So I know I get that Swagger UI by default, right? Like I install some packages, I get that Swagger UI by default. What are some of the ways that we could start customizing that interface? Because I know out of the box, like we get that testable UI, but I'm sure there's some other things that we could do to really like fine tune what that experience looks like.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess the thing is kind of where to start. I suppose the first thing I would say is, if you go to the Swashbuckle homepage in GitHub, and this is currently where I have all my documentation. It's all in the big long README. It's pretty. I would say the docs are pretty decent, but it's time for this to move to a dedicated doc site, like something like Read the Docs, and that's in the works. But I would still point people to this, because you kind of get that initial documentation out of the box. It's really nice to be able to just spin up an app, and there you go, bang, you've got documentation. But there is, as always, there's customizations you want to make, and there's different things. There's so many different ways you can customize, all these different kind of use cases for the different things you might want to do. You can list like operation responses. There's even support for kind of inheritance and polymorphism. There's a million ways that you can kind of extend this and customize it. I might just demo a few. Would that make sense?
Yeah, let's do a couple of demos.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
let's see. So what would you think for most developers that are just starting to build APIs? What are some of the more common tweaks that they'd probably want to make?
Yeah. So I'll show you one thing that I think sometimes trips people up. And I'll talk through this is the serializer that's being used under the hood, right? So whatever serializer your application is using is that's going to determine the behavior of your API, in particular the shape of your payloads, right? So you can see the response body. If I might be using a serializer, I might be using a system text JSON, and I have it configured to output, to serialize properties in Pascal case or maybe Camel case. That's important that Swashbuckle takes that into account. Because again, it's trying to accurately describe the behavior of your API. So one thing that can Swashbuckle currently supports the system text JSON serializer that comes out of the box now with ASP.NET Core, but it does also support Newtonsoft JSON. So maybe I'd show you how, if you wanted to use Newtonsoft, how you might configure that. So let's just do
Yeah,
some.
let's do that. And then as you're doing that, I also have another question too,
Sure.
which would be, so we're talking about different types of JSON serializers, but what if my API returns other things? So what if for whatever reason, I want to return XML? Or what if I have my own custom serializer that returns a
Yeah.
CSV or some other thing?
Okay.
How hard is it for me to integrate those types of additional formats inside of OpenAPI?
You're asking me the hard questions now, but
Sorry.
we'll no, no. Yeah, let's just do this real quick, and then I'll definitely answer that question. So
Sure.
this is one of the system text JSON attributes. Let's say for whatever reason we've decided it's a good idea to emit this property from our API as a name foobar instead of summary. So this is what I'm changing here is API behavior. This is nothing to do with Swashbuckle. I'm changing the actual behavior of my API. So if I was to call that get endpoint, it's going to emit this summary field as foobar. So I would like my documentation to reflect that. So I've added this JSON property name. So if I refresh my docs here, you should see Swashbuckle has honored that system, that serializer attribute, and it's saying, yeah, this property is going to be emitted as foobar. So that's all good. What happens if I'm not using system text JSON, but I'm using Newtonsoft instead? So let me just bear with me one sec, and we'll just add in Newtonsoft, right? So if you're building web API and you want to use Newtonsoft, if this will be a familiar step to a lot of people. I'm sure a lot of people still use Newtonsoft. You would pull in this library here, ASP.NET Core MVC Newtonsoft, and I believe 5.03 is the latest version. And then what you do is you got to go in here and say add Newtonsoft JSON, right? So now that's the serializer that's going to be used for that is a serializer that's going to be used for serializing our payloads. So the property that Newtonsoft uses here is called JSON property. So let's have a look at it here. You can see there using JSON property. Let's build it and regenerate our docs. Okay, this isn't what we want, right? You can see here, it still thinks that this field is going to be emitted as summary, but actually it's in reality. So let's try that out real quick. If we try it out, so now the actual behavior is emitting it as foobar, and this is because out of the box, Swashbuckle will honor the system text JSON serializer. So yeah, there's a small tweak that you have to do. Unfortunately, it'd be nice if I could make this magic, and maybe I'll look into that at some point. But right now, there's a small tweak that you need to do here to have Swashbuckle honor the Newtonsoft serializer behavior instead. So again, We go back to our project file. This is just another Swashbuckle package called ASP.NET Core. Let's see, Newton soft. Okay. And then kind of following the same pattern as MVC, it kind of has this separate config option where you say services.add Swagger Newtonsoft support. So you run that in there. Now we're telling Swashbuckle to honor, we're saying, look, our application uses the Newtonsoft serializer. Let's have it honor that when it generates the docs. And hopefully now when we regenerate these, we look at them, we can see it's using the right property name. And this applies for all of the serializer behavior, right? So there's a ton of different properties you can use. There's also kind of global configuration that you can do in your, when you configure your serializer, and really Swashbuckle, once you do this, it'll honor all of those things. So this is one tip that I would definitely say to people. If you're using Swashbuckle and you're also using the JSON.NET or Newtonsoft serializer, I would recommend that you tell Swashbuckle to put in this a little additional piece, because it means you're really getting a more accurate generated docs. So that's that. So
yeah, and I actually had to use this one time. So out of the box, if you use JSON Patch, so for folks that use JSON Patch for put requests and doing partial updates, JSON Patch is only supported today if you use Newtonsoft. It's not supported by System Text JSON. So I had to install these packages the other day so that I could, one, get JSON Patch support, but two, see my JSON Patch document properly rendered inside of the Swagger document.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and this one definitely, I think this definitely trips up people. So I thought it'd be a useful one to show. So going back to your question, okay, I think there was two questions. The first one is pretty easy to answer. If we're talking about different media types, right, like JSON versus text, XML, we'll come to that next. So let's just start with the question around different media types. So if I'm just going to close all this stuff and let's take another look at our generated OpenAPI document. You can see here.
Could you make that a little bigger, because that's really small?
Sure,
we can zoom in a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah,
that
that's good.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you can see here. Okay, we've got our get operation, and it's telling us here it returns a 200 response, and the content for that 200 response, it can either be, it supports, and this would be based on your accept header that you provide in your request, but this is saying that the API supports a response in the text plain media type, the application JSON media type, and the text JSON media type. And this seems like it's documenting too much. Actually, this is true, right? These media types are supported. If you go into Postman and you call this endpoint and you put in an accept header of text plain, you will get a response. They are supported, and that is why Swashbuckle, it doesn't try and second guess what you think your documentation should be. It just says, this is how the app behaves, and I'm going to document it. So if you want to, let's say you really only want your application to support the application JSON media type, and what you can do is, as with most things with Swashbuckle, start with the behavior and let the behavior drive the documentation. So how do I tell ASP.NET Core that this get method should only support the application JSON media type? Very, very easy. They have a produces attribute, and you can literally put in application JSON. So now that operation only supports that media type. So if this all goes according to plan, when I refresh here, Swashbuckle honors that. It's like, yeah, okay, now I know the application is behaving differently. It's limited to just this media type, and it only displays that one. So that's a way that you can kind of get your documentation and your API itself to be a bit tighter in what it does. So I think Brady talks about that one a little bit in the blog. Your last question, around, well, how do we support something like XML? So that is not really, XML isn't well supported at the moment. If you do add an XML, if you add XML support to your application, Swashbuckle will just use whichever it'll just use like the JSON serializer that you have in place to basically create a description of those XML elements, which may look fine depending on how you serialize your XML. But really, what needs to happen is just like Swashbuckle supports system text JSON, just like it supports Newtonsoft JSON.net, it also needs support for the XML serializers, and really the specific XML serializers that are available. And that's something that's on the roadmap. It's high priority, on the list of issues that need to be addressed, and that's something that's coming. There is an abstraction called iSchema generator, an interface, and you need to provide an implementation for that interface. So if that's something that folks or the community are interested in looking at, I think that would be a great addition to the tool. But I would say you can get away with XML, but it's not going to be as accurate. The descriptions it creates isn't going to be as accurate as the system text JSON or Newtonsoft ones.
Sure, and that's understandable. Because one of the main reasons I asked the question too was like every time I think about web APIs, I think about content negotiation, right? And sometimes I want to return JSON, sometimes I might want to return a picture, sometimes I might want to return, I don't know, like CSV or a protobuf file or something different. And so I kind of was just wondering, like, what would that mean for documentation if I want to support content negotiation with these different types of media types? It sounds like you said you can just create that iSchema provider, I think is what you called it.
There's that's how you would support, because so really the way that within let me just show you the document real quick. So within the OpenAPI specification, the way that it describes actual payloads, if you look at this, right, this is referencing a shared schema in the document, and the shared schemas are down here, but you can see this weather forecast. This here is actually what's called JSON schema, and people will be familiar with that. That's a fairly well-known metadata language. It's really was designed for validating JSON payloads, JSON objects, but it's used in the context of OpenAPI to actually describe responses and parameters and bodies. And so really, when you're talking about XML, this might look very different. Maybe in XML you don't you call the property as something else. And I would also say the OpenAPI specification itself. So maybe we'll just have a quick look at this. I would say that the support for XML is somewhat limited itself anyway. It's kind of because the schema structure is based on this JSON schema. Like, it's really a schema that's designed for describing
JSON APIs,
JSON objects. But they have kind of added this XML object where you can kind of enrich your schema with some additional metadata that kind of tells you about the XML side of it. So if you were looking to add support to Swashbuckle for an XML media type, then you would need to create something that looks at your serializer, your objects, and is able to generate one of these schemas, and then also includes this XML specific metadata. So it's definitely for XML, it's a non-trivial feature to add, but it's definitely high on the list of priorities. Okay,
gotcha. That makes sense. All right, so we talked about the JSON thing. We spoke about like those different serializers. How can we customize the status codes? Because I know sometimes I use it and just out of the box by default, like sometimes the right returning status code is not there. Like by default, I think they all say 200 OK. But what if I want error codes? What if I want multiple error codes? What if I want, multiple success codes? Like, how would I do that?
Yeah. So the way that this works, and this is where Swashbuckle has to break a little bit from that philosophy of the behavior is kind of the truth, right? Because most error codes, I don't know if there's any way. So there is a way to kind of just for documentation purposes specify a different response code, and this is part of ASP.NET Core. You can say produces response type. Let's say we decide this should be a 201, right, instead of a 200. I can do that, right? And let's have a look at the docs that were generated here. So you can see now, refresh this, and now instead of a 200, this is a 201. So you can do that, and then you could add, if you wanted to add like a 400 error here. You can also specify the type, right? So you might return a problem details object here for let's see, I think I need to do this. Okay, so this is one way that you can start to enrich your document with different error codes. The thing here is, though, this is there's nothing, it's still up to me to actually implement that within the code inside the method, right? So it's kind of saying, okay, you kind of need to remember to add these response codes here. So, but really there's no other way at the moment to because the way that you typically implement response codes within one of these methods is you'll use one of the different methods on the controller, right? So you might use OK, it's going to be a 200, or you might use created is going to be a 201. Because that's actual runtime code, there's no easy way for something like Swashbuckle to just figure out what different return types is your operation providing. So this is one area where it is really up to the developer to kind of document your response codes here using these attributes that are actually provided from ASP.NET Core. One thing you can do to make this a little easier, and I actually didn't know about this until I read Brady's blog yesterday. So rather than having to fill all these in, and actually I think I might need to add another method here. So let's just add the corresponding post method to create one of these weather forecast objects. Not a weak reference.
Yeah, and as you're doing that, one of the things that I was thinking is, so sure, Swashbuckle can't know those things by default in terms of the return types, but would it be possible to write like a Roslyn analyzer that could inspect your method and see what those different returns are, and then have Roslyn auto-magically include some of those types of things inside of Swashbuckle?
Yeah, I it would be possible. It's not something I've done, but yeah, that actually would be, and that that could actually be an add-on to Swashbuckle, right? That could be an open, if someone wanted to go and build that, that would be, Swashbuckle has a lot of extensibility points where it's pretty easy to add kind of additional projects that could add that type of thing, right? So you could certainly, if someone had the brains, which I don't, to go and write something like that, they could very easily make that available as an open source package that just hooks into Swashbuckle via one of the extensibility points that it provides. So yeah, that would be a very interesting thing to do.
Yeah, I've never created a Roslyn analyzer myself, and maybe that's something we can have someone come and talk about on the show later. But I think it would be a great example of how you could use it to kind of increase that developer productivity. So now I won't have to add all these attributes, and instead the analyzer could figure some of that stuff out.
Yeah. Sorry, excuse me. So what I wanted to show here, and the reason why I created an additional method, is you can use these web API conventions here, and this is all built into ASP.NET Core, right? So let's see, I think you can do type of default API conventions. Let's see, what's it complaining about here? I guess I gotta.
Oh, you're adding the API conventions. Yeah, I've seen.
Yeah, do I need to do this? I don't know.
No, you shouldn't need to do anything else. You should just be. I don't think it's API convention method. I think it's just API convention. But let me check.
I think it's API convention type. No. There we go. Yeah, I think that's it there. Okay, so we got this here, right? So this is just one thing that's provided. I guess so. Just to describe what's happening here, ASP.NET Core does ship with a metadata, an API metadata layer. It's a component called API Explorer, and it surfaces a lot of information about your API about your API in its own kind of internal format. And Swashbuckle actually builds on top of that built-in metadata layer to generate the OpenAPI document. So a lot of these attributes, like the produces response type, that actually results in adding additional metadata to API Explorer, which is then picked up by Swashbuckle, and that's how it works. And the same thing happens here with this convention. So if you put this in your controller, what this will do, it will automatically add those error codes, those produces response types, based on kind of common conventions. So for a post method, it will add the 200 response type, but it will also add a 400, for a bad request, because it's accepting something from the body. I don't think by convention there's just a 200 for a get. So that's why I added the post method. So I think.
Yeah, and if you go to the default API conventions, if you control click it in Visual Studio, you could actually look at the conventions. So you could actually see what it does.
Oh, right.
Yeah,
okay.
So if you see on the left side, I think if you expand the arrow, right, so like you're going to see a lot of attributes there, but all those attributes are essentially what it's applying. So it's looking at the names, looking at the parameter, and it's looking at a bunch of other things to let you know like how is it applied.
So I'm assuming you can probably define your own conventions, right? These are just the default ones.
Right. So what I've done in the past is I've looked at this class, right? And so the method names don't matter. Well, when I say the method, like the actual methods don't matter because the methods have no implementation; they're just empty. But what matters is if you notice like the different conventions, the convention methods, you see online. If you look online, if you stop there on line 4, for instance, you can see there's one that says convention name match, for instance. Like those types of things, you could specify whatever your company's convention is. So maybe instead of get, you call it retrieve or fetch or something like that, right? And you want to use your own company's naming conventions, you can kind of copy this and use it. One of the things so I like that about it. The one thing I don't like about it, or the one thing I wish it could do, is I wish it could inherit from the previous one. So I wish I could have a convention, like the default convention, and then I could add my own ones to the convention, but without having to like rewrite the whole thing. So right now you got to like write the whole thing. It's like an all or nothing type deal with it.
Yeah. No, that's cool. I wasn't even aware of this. So this is I'm learning here as well. This is great. So yeah, just to see that in operation, then I think if I, based on those predefined conventions, if I look at my post method, you can see it's by default it's adding those different response codes, which is cool. So that definitely would save a developer quite a lot of work if you have your own conventions within your company, for what common response codes are returned from your different API types. Yeah, you just define it there, and I think you can apply this at the assembly level as well, so you don't have to go and do it for every controller.
Nice. So another customization I wanted you to talk about really quick was the operation IDs. Yeah. Now, when I first started messing around with OpenID and Swashbuckle, I didn't really think the operation ID was a big deal, but I've come to learn the error of my ways, and I've realized like this is a big deal, particularly when you want to do other things more than just documentation, right? So could you talk about that really quickly?
Yeah. Let's see, what do we got here? So yeah, let's take a look at the OpenAPI document again. So as we document the different parts of this operation. One optional field for this operation description is what's called an operation ID, and it's optional. But what it does is it's very useful if you are using this OpenAPI document to generate a client. So if you're using AutoRest or NSwag or Swagger CodeGen, it's going to want to create a method, whether it's building a client for Ruby or C# or JavaScript. It's going to want to create a corresponding method for this operation. And if you don't provide an explicit operation ID, it's going to try, and most of those clients just try and generate a method, usually based on a mix of the path and the HTTP method, and it never really looks very good. So Swashbuckle did at one point try to generate kind of friendly names, but it's too difficult. It just became, there was just too many issues with it. It was very difficult to get it right. It's something really that's very expressive if you want to use it to generate client methods. So what I opted for in Swashbuckle was not to generate it by default, just leave it blank, but make it very easy to be explicit. So if you want to explicitly provide an operation ID,
I think we lost him. I think he's paused for a second. Let me see if I can get him back really quickly. Just hold on, folks. This happens. The internet happens. So we'll see. We'll try to get Richie back in a second. All right, you're back.
Oh, okay, cool. So yeah, you guys can hear me?
Yep, can hear you just fine. Keep going.
Okay, yeah. So as I was saying, if you want to be explicit about the operation ID that's generated, you can use the name attribute here on your post method, or on any of your route attributes there, and let's rebuild it. And then, as you can see here, now it'll output this operation ID with that name. And if you're using a client generator, it's going to create a method called createWeather, exactly based on this string. So that's quite useful. Definitely something I'd recommend if you're using the generated OpenAPI document for things outside of just the Swagger UI.
Thanks. And I think this kind of goes forward to drive a bigger point, because when we first started talking about Swagger and OpenAPI, we only really spoke about documentation, right? But the capability expands much further outside of documentation and test UIs, right? Like you said, like you can generate clients, right? Like client libraries, and not just .NET client libraries, but I'm guessing a wide variety of different programming languages. And then I'm also guessing you could do things like, testing and mocking and some other interesting type of scenarios from your APIs using something like this.
Yeah, and I haven't got a good demo for this, but there's kind of a piece of beta functionality that I've been I added to Swashbuckle a while ago, which kind of tries to do this. I'll see if I can stumble my way through it here, just to give you an idea.
Sure.
But this was me kind of starting to think about that whole opposite approach, right? Going design first, generating a spec first. How could I provide a tool that helps with that if you want to go with that approach? And one thing that kind of made sense to me is usually when we write APIs, we create integration tests. We'll normally want to create an integration test for, at least a happy path to call the operation. Maybe we'll even want to create one for the different response codes, just to make sure that our contract stays the same as we develop our API. And so, you end up writing these integration tests, and you're specifying a get to this route, and then you're checking that the right response code comes back. And it kind of occurred to me, really what you're doing in those integration tests is you're describing your API. And why do that multiple times? So what I start to think about is, okay, what if you just created the OpenAPI document first? So you go with that design first approach, and then you provide a simple way to run integration tests based on that your API description. So this is an example, like this is kind of a part of the library called API testing, and then I provided an XUnit kind of bridge for it. So you could set up, if you look at this application here, right, test first. I've got a OpenAPI document here that I just created in that online editor,
Mm-hmm.
and expose it here. Um, so that's in the API, and then I've kind of created this way where you can. This is just configuring the tooling here to say, base it on this OpenAPI document. But these are the integration tests for this test first API, and I'll just try and get to the point real quick here because I see we're running low on time. But the idea here is that it takes that document, and then you can create just a quick test for returns 201. So you tell it that operation ID so then it knows, it gets the description of the test out of that spec, and it's saying, I want to test the 201 response, and then you give it the request message, and you can run your test. So this would be the create product tests. Let's run them here. And it's basically pulling in that API document, and it's making sure that everything is behaving within the test as you'd expect, which it is. So let's say, so you can see here, returns 201 if the content is valid, and the content is valid because I've specified in my OpenAPI document that the name property in the payload is required. If I take this out, so let's say I took this out, and then rerun the test. It fails, and it gives me a message to say, the content does not match the spec, required properties not present. So the idea here being, and I need to do a bit more work on this part of it, but the idea here is that you create your OpenAPI document first, and then you just create these simple tests that really are pretty much based on the various operation definitions. And then you'll run the test, it'll fail, then you'll go to your controllers, you'll implement it, the test will pass. So that whole kind of test-driven development approach you could do in this way. And then the nice thing about all that is, because you've created your OpenAPI document, you have it, and you can still use Swashbuckle to expose the Swagger UI and that nice UI that you get, but you're doing it in a design first workflow. So that's just another piece, I think, that it's definitely not very mature. I don't think I've even got this documented yet, but it's something I'll be exploring a little bit more to see if Swashbuckle could provide more functionality to help people who are going with that design first approach.
Nice. So a couple of things I want to call out before we keep going. One, we just got rated. So the Diabolical just rated us with 13 folks. So thank you so much for joining us. Everyone that's just joining the stream. My name is Celso Philip, and this is Richie. And we're here talking about OpenAPI with ASP.NET Core. So if you want to talk about OpenAPI, if you want to talk about ASP.NET Core, you're definitely welcome to hang out and listen to what's going on over here. Other thing I want to talk about really quick, looks like we had some questions. I think Billy Badbones. So Billy, I'm thinking about your question wrong, but you're asking, those are content types, or those content types point to the same URL. So so I guess he was talking about when you were doing like the consumes produces section, particularly in the Swagger UI. And so he wanted to know, like, when we were customizing those content types, like what exactly would they be associated with? I'm guessing that's the question. If I'm asking the question wrong, Billy, like, let me know, but I'm thinking that's what we're talking about.
Yeah. So when you specify those, when you use the consumes or produces attribute in your code, you can target at the controller level, which means it's for all of the operations, or you can do it at the action level. I'm not sure if that's the question, but what it really means is that, yeah, it's the same URL, right? It's the same operation, and this is really content negotiation, right? It's a post, in this example, a post to weather forecast. What kind of content types does your API accept for that? At the moment, out of the box, your API will accept all of these different content types. You can add to these, you can remove them. You can do that with the consumes attribute, and you might want to support XML as well. And if you do add the XML serializer to your MVC configuration, you'll see application/XML pop up here, and they are all for the same endpoint, the same operation. You can just change the media type that's submitted.
Okay. So yeah, so Billy, hopefully that answers your question. If it doesn't, let us know, and then we could try our best to figure that part out for you. So what else do we want to cover? So I know we're getting close on time. If anyone has any questions for Richie, please go ahead, drop it in the chat. I'll make sure that we get those answered for you. In the meantime, I do want to talk about the roadmap and what does the future for Swashbuckle and ASP.NET Core together kind of look like, right? Like, are there new features, new versions of the Swagger tools that you're incorporating? I know we saw the testing to it. I'm guessing that'll be a part of a future plan as well.
Yeah, I'm trying to kind of just get on top of the whole thing, which I've managed to do. Sometimes I just need to give it a day or two and just kind of go through issues and pull requests and try and get up to date. I definitely want to make it more of a community driven. I mean, definitely it's got a ton of pull requests and have been merged in, and I'm really grateful for all that. But I'd like to get to a point where I'm not the bottleneck. So trying to kind of build a bit more of a core team, and there's a couple of contributors we have now. We have a Microsoft employee who's one of the contributors as well, who has kind of push permissions. So I'd like to get to that point, and there's a few things I want to do. I want to improve the documentation and then get some more documentation in place around contributing, and kind of the roadmap and stuff like that. So that's something that I'm going to be working on. And then once that's in place, I think the focus is going to be adding things like support for XML. Let's see. I mean, I think that's the big one. Yeah, maybe maturing that kind of testing library a bit to have potential to support the design first workflow. I think they're the main things that I'd be working on. Probably better support for content negotiation, for being able to describe your schemas slightly differently, whether it's depending on whether it's XML, what the content type is. There's kind of design changes that would need to happen to support that. So yeah, a lot of that kind of stuff is kind of the plan at the moment.
Yeah, we got a question real quick from YouTube. This person's saying, or the comment is, I find the most painful part of Swashbuckle is hooking up the OAuth 2 stuff. Do you have any comments? I haven't tried it myself, so do you have any comments about how the OAuth 2 stuff kind of works?
To be honest, I don't think that's a consequence of Swashbuckle. It's quite. If you look at how do you describe the OAuth 2 behavior in an OpenAPI document, it's a little bit complicated. You have to create a security scheme definition, and then you have to kind of, for each operation, you have to say, well, okay, this operation, one of those schemes that I've defined is applicable to that operation. So it's a little bit involved, even if you just take Swashbuckle out of the picture. Just the way that you define OAuth 2 interactions for your API with OpenAPI is a little tricky. It's a little nuanced. There's possibly some things Swashbuckle could do to make it a little easier, but I think for the moment, like, the goal is really just to expose OpenAPI, right? And if you're finding it difficult to do something like wire up OAuth 2, I would start by looking at the OpenAPI specification, understanding how that does it, because really, when you're doing that in Swashbuckle code, you're really just using an object model that represents the OpenAPI spec, and so starting by understanding the spec, I think, is probably a good place when it comes to OAuth 2. I will say the Swagger UI team has done a really phenomenal job. It's pretty cool when you do get it wired up, just to be able to support the sandbox, but with all the different OAuth flows. So, yeah, I agree. I understand the comment, and yeah, there could be some improvements there.
I think one option that would be interesting is if, I don't know if it's you or us or the community or someone, but if there could be a template that comes out of the box that says, hey, I want OpenAPI, I want, I want ASP.NET, I want Web APIs, I want Swagger, I want OAuth security and whatever. And it's, it adds the identity server thing, it adds the Swashbuckle pieces, it adds client generation, and a lot of these, I guess, the foundational pieces to it. But then, along with that weather API that we always get, right? We always delete. But along with that, just show me an example of how I can authenticate that. But not only just authenticate it, but like, how does that look inside of a Swagger UI? Like, and how do I define it and spec it out? And I get it, it's hard, but being able to see some living samples goes a long way, right? And then now we could start playing with the options and tweaking things and moving things around to kind of figure out how those things work.
Yeah, absolutely. And just one on that point, one thing, another place that I would direct people to for inspiration is if the Swashbuckle repo. There is a ton of sample websites here, right? So, and it's worth looking at these. They cover a couple of different common use cases using the CLI tool, working with multiple versions, NSwag example, but there's also an OAuth 2 integration example. And this actually wires up identity server. It wires up Swagger then to support the flow, and you can run it and you can test it out. So this sometimes is a place people don't look, but it's where I would direct people to for inspiration for certain, if they just want to see a sample application that works and does something a little bit out of the ordinary with Swashbuckle.
Got it. Okay. Cool. All right, no more questions so far. So in closing, why don't we tell folks, if they're interested in getting started, if they want to reach out to you, like, where are some places that you'd want to direct folks to go to?
Yeah, I think at the moment, I think on the
it's all on GitHub.
It's all on GitHub at the moment. Yeah, on the repo itself. If you want to reach out, I mean, you could ping me on Twitter as well. My handle is domain driven dev on Twitter. But yeah, as I said, this is something that I need to do. If I really want this to be more community driven, I think I need to kind of make it more accessible and kind of give people make it easier for people to know how to get involved. And that's something that I plan on doing pretty soon. But for now, just even if you want to just create an issue, and I mean, there is an issue there, I think, that talks about support, getting more community participation, and maybe post a comment in there. But I'll work on making creating more avenues for people to get involved.
Cool. All right, great. So again, like you said before, if you want to get started and trying out Swashbuckle, definitely head over to GitHub. Go to GitHub and the Swashbuckle ASP.NET Core repo. And also to Richie, are you active on Twitter or any of the social things that people could reach out to you on, or not really?
I mean, a little bit on Twitter, but not much.
Okay, so definitely come here, open an issue, and I think we also have some docs as well inside of the ASP.NET Core documentation that go through some very basic, generating clients, setting up Swagger UI, and some of these types of things. So definitely go ahead and check those out. And so that'll be it. That'll be it for our show today. Now, we'll be back next week. We're going to continue with API Month and talking about all the great things that we can build with .NET Core and Web APIs and all the other cool things. definitely look out. I'm sure Brady's going to have some more blog posts next week that we can look out to, and we'll make sure we'll share those as well with you. But other than that, I mean, thank you all for joining us. We appreciate you spending an hour of your day with us today, and we'll be back next time for another episode of .NET Live. Bye, everyone.